Please subscribe to my channel. This is my sincere request to you. My dad dropped the folder on the dining table, cornering me with terrifying calm. Just one signature from my brother, he claimed. But I knew instantly those documents were not a simple loan. They were a calculated trap. When they kicked me out that very night, cash did not save me. My grandmother's old card did. It was the ultimate key to a buried truth, one that would soon send my entire family into a desperate panic. I am Violet Baker. I am 31 years old, living in the quiet, relentlessly manicured suburbs of Columbus, Ohio by day. I am a contract compliance specialist for Crest Hollow Health Network. It is a massive private corporation known throughout the state for being ruthlessly strict, bound by endless regulations and exhaustive daily audits. It is a high-pressure environment, but it offers the exact kind of sterile, unwavering stability I crave. I make a very comfortable income. My credit report is absolutely spotless, and I live my life by a rigid set of principles. Order is my sanctuary. The clauses, the fine print, the clear delineations of responsibility, these things make perfect sense to me. But sanctuaries, I have learned the hard way, are fragile things when you share blood with the people actively trying to dismantle them. It started with a rent increase on my downtown apartment, a steep one, roughly 40% higher than what I had been paying for the last 3 years. I told myself it was the perfect logical excuse to temporarily move back into the small in-law suite located just behind my parents' house. It was a detached unit, and I planned to stay for just a few months. I reasoned it would be just long enough to save for a substantial down payment on a condominium of my own. It seemed like a practical, harmless financial decision. I realized far too quickly that my temporary stay had been weaponized. The physical proximity became an unspoken mandate from my family to oversee my entire existence. It began with casual, seemingly innocent questions about my work schedule and my whereabouts. Then came the subtle, passive-aggressive critiques of my financial choices. Eventually, it morphed into a suffocating blanket of control over my personal decisions, all heavily disguised as warm parental concern. The suite was no longer a practical stepping stone. It had become a glass cage. My father, Douglas Baker, is not a man who yells. He does not need to raise his voice to make you feel incredibly small. He possesses a specific brand of quiet, terrifying authority where every casual sentence he utters carries the dead weight of a military command. When he suggests you do something, it is never actually a suggestion. It is a strict directive wrapped in the thin, transparent illusion of free will. He controls the temperature of any room just by walking into it. My mother, Linda Baker, is the eternal enabler, the designated peacemaker of the house. She is the one who expertly sugarcoats his harsh demands, smoothing the jagged edges of his control with soft smiles and dramatic, breathy sighs about the paramount importance of family unity. She frames every unreasonable expectation, every single boundary crossed as a necessary, noble sacrifice for the greater good of our household. Together, they form an impenetrable wall of guilt and obligation that leaves you constantly questioning your own sanity. And then there is my younger brother, Gavin. Gavin Baker lines his entire life balancing precariously on an endless series of second, third, and 50th chances. He is the golden boy whose shine is constantly tarnished by his own sheer incompetence, yet constantly polished back to a dull, deceptive gleam by my parents. His latest venture is a storm and water damage restoration company he aggressively named Forgecraft Mitigation. To hear him talk at the dinner table, gesturing wildly with his fork, he is a misunderstood visionary on the absolute brink of a massive industry breakthrough. He wears custom-embroidered company polo shirts everywhere he goes and talks incessantly about expanding operations across multiple county lines. The reality, however, is a rapidly sinking ship. He is drowning in heavy equipment rental bills he cannot pay, suffocating under mounting overdue debt to local suppliers, and making bold commitments to distressed homeowners that far exceed his actual labor capacity. He plays the role of a budding mogul flawlessly, but the backdrop behind the curtain is a crumbling, desperate facade of unpaid invoices, bounced checks, and missed deadlines. In the distorted, toxic ecosystem of the Baker family, the roles were assigned decades ago and carved deeply into stone. Gavin is the one who perpetually needs to be saved from his own disastrous choices. I am the one who can carry the heavy weight because I am responsible, because my credit score is perfect, because I save my money. I became the unofficial, non-consensual safety net. Over the years, financial burdens would just magically slide across the dining table toward me. A co-signature for his inflated commercial auto insurance policy here, a minor legal fee to settle a botched subcontractor dispute there, a hefty security deposit for a temporary warehouse space. It was never asked of me directly, plainly, or honestly. It was always presented through the manipulative, cloying language of kinship. Family helps family, my mother would say, her eyes welling with highly calculated tears. We just need a little bridge loan until his next big commercial job clears, my father would add, his cold, flat tone, leaving absolutely no room for refusal or debate. To survive in that environment without losing my mind completely, I had to learn the exhausting, paranoid art of constant vigilance. I adapted like a soldier operating behind enemy lines. I stopped keeping any of my important identification documents in the main house. My passport, birth certificate, and social security card lived in a heavy fireproof locked box hidden deep beneath the floorboards in my closet. I never checked my bank accounts or my credit score while connected to their home internet network. I learned to swallow my tongue and never discuss my salary bonuses, my growing savings account, or anything remotely related to personal finance in front of Gavin. I knew that if he caught even a faint scent of available cash, a brand new catastrophic business crisis would conveniently materialize by morning. My defensive, fiercely guarded posture did not go unnoticed. My family quickly labeled me cold. They called me intensely selfish behind my back and quite frequently straight to my face. They loudly lamented my apparent unwillingness to sacrifice for the blood that bound us together, interpreting my healthy boundaries as a vicious personal attack against their twisted definition of unconditional love. They called my basic self-preservation a tragic lack of empathy. There was only one person in my entire life who ever truly saw this dysfunctional dynamic for exactly what it was. My grandmother, Lorraine Mercer. She was my mother's mother, but looking at them side by side, they could not have been more fundamentally different. Lorraine was a woman of incredibly few words, intensely private and fiercely, almost intimidatingly independent. She owned a handful of aging industrial properties down by the old city riverfront, remnants of a different, grittier era of the city's economic history. She used to sit at the absolute periphery of our chaotic family gatherings, sipping black coffee and watching the Bakers interact with a chilling, detached clarity. She looked at my parents and my brother the way a seasoned meteorologist watches a slow-moving, devastating storm approach on radar, quietly observing the impending disaster she had foreseen decades ago. She saw right through Douglas's quiet bullying and daily intimidation. She saw through Linder's weaponized fragility and expertly manufactured tears. She saw through Gavin's hollow charm and chronic financial incompetence. Most importantly, she saw exactly what they were doing to me, how they were slowly hollowing me out piece by piece to build up their golden child. Not long before she passed away, she asked me to come over to her house alone. The air in her small, dimly lit living room smelled strongly of dried lavender, old paper, and an unspoken, impending finality. She did not offer me tea or try to engage in polite small talk about my job at the hospital network. Instead, she reached into the deep pocket of her heavy wool cardigan and handed me a card. It was a dense, heavy charcoal-colored piece of plastic, feeling almost like a small slab of dark slate resting in my palm. Embossed across the front in austere raised silver lettering were the two words Mercer Reserve. I turned it over in my hands, thoroughly confused by the object. It did not look like any normal bank debit or credit card I had ever seen. There was no thick black magnetic stripe across the back, just a small metallic security chip and a single toll-free phone number printed in a tiny, unassuming font. When I looked back up, her pale, sharp eyes were locked intensely onto mine. She did not explain what kind of account it was attached to. nor did she provide me with a PIN number to access any concealed funds. She just held my unwavering gaze and delivered a single haunting sentence that would echo in my mind for years to come. The day they turn you into a signature instead of a relative, walk away alone. At the time, standing in her quiet, dusty house, I thought it was just the cryptic, highly dramatic rambling of an old woman nearing the very end of her complicated life. I slipped the heavy, dark card into the very back slot of my leather wallet and tried my absolute best to forget the chilling absolute certainty in her fading voice. I went back to my small suite, back to my predictable spreadsheets, back to my careful, heavily guarded existence. I did not know then that she had not just given me a piece of useless decorative plastic. She had handed me the master key to a deeply buried vault of truth, a weapon forged in decades of foresight, and she knew exactly the precise moment I would be forced to use it against the people who loudly claimed to love me most. The Sunday evening before the holiday break began with an unnatural, sickening smoothness. My father had explicitly demanded a proper family dinner, a phrase that usually signaled either a severe reprimand or a highly choreographed financial ambush. The dining room table was set with a good china, the pieces my mother only dusted off when she needed the environment to feel uncomfortably formal. The smell of her signature pot roast hung heavy in the air, masking the metallic tang of anxiety that always coated the back of my throat during these mandatory gatherings. The clinking of heavy silver forks against porcelain plates was the only sound for the first 20 minutes. My mother hummed a tuneless melody while refilling watered glasses, overplaying her role as the blissful matriarch. The air was so thick with manufactured peace that my internal alarms were screaming. Gavin cleared his throat, pushing his half-eaten plate away. This was the cue. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood, adopting the earnest, hungry look of a man about to sell a bridge. He announced that his restoration company had just secured a massive commercial contract. It was the game changer, he promised, his hands chopping through the air to emphasize the phantom scale of his success. But he added, his voice dropping an octave to simulate humility, scaling up required immediate capital. He rattled off a highly specific list of necessities. He needed 4 industrial rotary dehumidifiers, 2 specialized box trucks, and a suite of advanced thermal imaging cameras for mold detection. He claimed the local bank was completely thrilled by his business plan. They were ready to underwrite the loan tomorrow morning, but because his company was relatively young, they just needed one tiny, insignificant favor. They needed a supporting signature from someone with an established flawless financial history. Before Gavin could launch into his practiced, emotional plea about brotherhood and mutual support, Douglas smoothly took over. He did not ask. He reached onto the empty chair beside him, lifted a thick manila folder, and slid it directly across the table. It glided over the mahogany and stopped precisely 1 inch from the edge of my watered glass. It was a calculated physical manifestation of his authority. It is just a short-term guarantee. My father said, his voice was entirely devoid of inflection, delivering the lie with the casual confidence of a man who fully expects absolute obedience. Your brother will have the entire balance zeroed out in exactly 6 months. The revenue from this new commercial contract will cover the principal twice over. Your credit is perfect. You will simply act as a temporary placeholder to satisfy the underwriters. It is a minor formality. I did not touch the folder immediately. I stared at the beige cover, feeling the collective gaze of my family burning into the side of my face. Slowly, deliberately, I opened the cover. The stack of paper inside was substantial, far too thick for a simple, unsecured equipment loan. My daily professional life revolved around dissecting complex legal agreements, hunting for the poison pills buried in the fine print. My eyes automatically bypassed the large friendly fonts on the summary page and drilled straight into the dense, single-spaced paragraphs of the attached addendums. Within 30 seconds, the cold reality of the trap snapped shut around me. This was not an equipment loan, not entirely. Buried beneath the standard repayment terms were clauses that made no logical sense for a few trucks and fans. I found a section boldly titled Collateral Consent. A few pages deeper, there was a binding document labeled Agreement of Managerial Capacity. Most damning of all was an environmental liability waiver that spanned 3 entire pages, packed with indemnification language that would legally bind the signatory to any toxic hazard remediation on an unspecified property. I kept my head down, forcing my breathing to remain steady, though my heart was hammering violently against my ribs. They were not asking me to co-sign a loan. They were asking me to legally bind myself to a piece of real estate, to assume management responsibilities I knew nothing about, and to absorb the catastrophic financial risk of environmental cleanup. I slowly looked up from the documents and met my father's cold gaze. Why does a loan for dehumidifiers require me to sign a consent form for property collateral? I asked. My voice was quiet, stripped of any emotion. And why is my name listed under an agreement of managerial capacity? I do not work for this company. I am not assuming environmental liability for a property you have not even identified in these pages. The silence that followed was absolute. The manufactured warmth of the family dinner evaporated instantly, replaced by a suffocating, freezing tension. Doubler's jaw clenched, the muscles in his neck pulled tight. He hated being questioned, but he despised being court even more. "Do not sit at my table and act like a corporate lawyer," Doublers snapped, his voice dropping into that terrifying growly register that meant a storm was breaking. "You do not need to understand the structural mechanics of commercial lending. You just need to support your family. You always have to do this," Gavin erupted, slamming his open palm against the wood so hard his water glass rattled. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson. "You always have to pick everything apart. You always have to prove you are the smartest person in the room. It is just standard boilerplate legal trash. Violet, the bank requires it. Why are you trying to ruin the biggest break of my entire life?" "I am not trying to ruin anything," I replied, closing the folder and pushing it firmly back toward the center of the table. "I am refusing to blindly sign away my financial life. I will not sign a single document for you, Gavin, especially not when I have never been allowed to see a complete ledger, a tax return, or a verified profit and loss statement for your business. Furthermore, I will absolutely not attach my signature to a property consent form when I do not even know what asset is being leveraged." Right on cue, Linder deployed her ultimate weapon. She gasped softly, pressing a napkin against her chest, as if I had physically struck her. "He is your own flesh and blood," she whispered, her voice trembling with expertly crafted disappointment. "He is out there working himself to the bone, trying so hard to build a real future for himself. And you sit there safe in your comfortable office job, hoarding your perfect credit score, refusing to lift a single finger to help him. Why are you so selfish? Why can you not think of someone other than yourself for one single minute?" She was weaponizing morality, twisting my logical self-defense into an act of familial treason. I looked at the three of them, my mother crying tears of manipulation, my brother vibrating with entitled rage, and my father watching me with the cold, calculating eyes of an apex predator whose trap had just malfunctioned. Doublers stood up slowly. He was a tall man, and he used his physical presence to dominate the space. He leaned over the table, placing both hands flat on the wood, staring down at me. "I am going to make this very simple for you," Doublers said, each word landing like a heavy stone. "You will pick up that pen. You will sign your name on the lines I'd have flagged for you. You will do it for your brother, or you will leave this house tonight permanently." The ultimatum hung in the air, toxic and heavy. For a fraction of a second, I felt the familiar crushing weight of lifelong conditioning pressing down on my shoulders, urging me to surrender, to sign the paper, just to make the screaming stop, just to restore the miserable peace. But then I remembered the dense, terrifying legal language on page 4 of that contract. I remembered the absolute certainty that this was a financial suicide pact. I kept my eyes locked on his. No. The single word shattered whatever fragile restraint was left in the room. Linder did not argue further. She turned abruptly and marched down the hallway toward the back door that led to my suite. She returned exactly 5 minutes later, dragging a small black overnight suitcase across the hardwood floor. She had violently shoved a few random items inside. I could see the sleeve of a silk work blouse and the heel of a black pump court precariously in the zipper. She dropped the bag at my feet. Gavin leaned back in his dining chair, crossing his arms over his chest. A sickening, satisfied smirk played across his lips in his deeply twisted narrative. He was the victim, and I had finally publicly proven myself to be the cold, ungrateful villain he always claimed I was. He had successfully orchestrated my exile without having to take an ounce of responsibility for his own failures. Doublers turned his back on me. He walked methodically down the front hallway, his heavy footsteps echoing in the silent house. He grasped the brass handle of the heavy front door and pulled it wide open. The freezing December wind immediately howled into the foyer, sweeping across the hardwood and chilling the room. He stood by the open frame, not looking at me, staring out into the dark, empty street. "Get out," he commanded, his voice entirely devoid of anger, which made it infinitely worse. It was the voice of a man discarding a broken tool. "Take your things and walk out that door, and let us see exactly how long you survive out there when you do not have your family to protect you." I stood up from the table. I did not look at my mother's fake tears, nor did I acknowledge my brother's triumphant smirk. I picked up the small, poorly packed suitcase by its handle. I walked down the hallway, my spine perfectly straight, every muscle in my body pulled incredibly tight. I stepped across the threshold into the biting cold of the winter night. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind me with a loud, absolute finality, the deadbolt clicking into place mere seconds later, locking me out of the only world I had ever known. I drove aimlessly for the first 2 hours. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly my knuckles itched, glowing bone white under the intermittent flash of passing street lights. In the passenger seat, the small black suitcase sat like a mocking passenger. Beside it rested my leatherwork tote containing my laptop. That was the sum total of my immediate existence. A few hastily grabbed blouses, mismatched socks, a computer, and the crushing, suffocating realization that the people who raised me did not make empty threats. When they realized they could not use me, they simply discarded me into the freezing Ohio night. I pulled into the empty parking lot of a closed strip mall to gather my bearings. The heater blasted warm air against my shins, but I was shaking uncontrollably from the inside out. I pulled out my phone. It was almost midnight. I scrolled through my contacts, the bright screen burning my tired eyes. I tapped the name of my oldest friend from college. The line rang 4 times before dropping into an automated voicemail. I did not leave a message. What could I possibly say that would not sound like a frantic, desperate plea? I tried another number, an old colleague who had recently moved to a nearby neighborhood. She answered on the 5th ring, her voice groggy and thick with sleep. When I asked if I could sleep on her sofa for just one night, a heavy, awkward pause swallowed the line. She stammered out a weak apology, muttering vaguely about how her husband was sensitive to unexpected guests and how it was always best to let family drama settle naturally before bringing outsiders into the mix. I thanked her quietly and ended the call. The isolation crystallized around me. It was no longer an abstract concept. It was a physical, freezing entity sitting right there in the car with me. I put the car back in gear and headed toward the downtown district. I figured I would just check into a decent business hotel, sleep for 8 hours, and figure out the logistics of finding a new apartment in the morning. I pulled up to the brightly lit portico of a major chain hotel. The night auditor behind the marble desk offered me a sympathetic, tight-lipped smile before informing me that the entire city center was completely booked out. A massive annual agricultural technology convention had swallowed up every available room within a 20-m radius. I tried 2 more hotels, receiving the exact same polite rejection. The universe, it seemed, was determined to make me feel the full unvarnished weight of my eviction. Out of options and running low on mental stamina, I eventually navigated toward a massive 24-hour supermarket on the edge of the city limits. I parked under the glaring hyper-white light of a towering security lamp, far away from the entrance where a few night shift workers were gathering shopping carts. I reclined my driver's seat a few inches and stared up at the fabric ceiling of my car. I opened my banking application. My checking account had a healthy balance. My savings account held enough for a substantial down payment on a property. I made a very good living. Yet, Sitting there at 3:00 in the morning in a frozen parking lot, I realized how entirely unprepared I was for this specific brand of ambush. I had mapped out retirement projections and emergency medical funds, but I had never factored in the sheer logistical nightmare of being exiled from my own home without an hour of warning. A sharp shiver racked my spine as the engine cycled off to save gas. I reached over to the passenger seat and unzipped the black suitcase, blindly digging through the chaotic mess my mother had packed. I just wanted my heavy wool winter coat. As I pulled the thick fabric free, my hand caught on something else. A small vintage leather coin purse, a faded little pouch I used to store meaningless keepsakes and old theater tickets, tumbled out. It hit the hard plastic of the center console and popped open. A single item slid out and landed on the passenger seat. It was the heavy charcoal-colored card my grandmother had given me all those years ago, the one embossed with the words Mercer Reserve. I had tucked it away in that old pouch purely out of a lingering sense of sentimentality, a reluctance to throw away one of the last physical items she had ever handed to me. I picked it up in the harsh artificial light filtering in from the parking lot. The dark surface seemed to absorb the glare rather than reflect it. For the first time in years, I turned the heavy piece of plastic over. There was no magnetic stripe. There was no signature box. There was only a physical address deeply engraved into the matte surface, followed by a zip code located squarely in the oldest, most historic section of the Columbus financial district. And beneath that address, etched in an incredibly tiny, precise font, were two simple words, present alone. I traced my thumb over the indented letters, sitting in the oppressive quiet of my cold car. Fragments of old memories began to surface, piercing through the fog of my exhaustion. I remembered the fierce, uncompromising set of my grandmother's jaw. I remembered her pulling me aside after my high school graduation, gripping my wrist with surprising strength, telling me to never lend my name to a contract I could not read in total darkness. I remembered the tense, silent Thanksgiving dinners where my father would casually bring up the rising property values of the old riverfront district, and the way Lorraine would just stare at him until he nervously changed the subject. I remembered the heavy brass key she kept pinned to the inside of her sweater, a key sheet with the intensity of someone protecting a state secret. She had watched my family operate. She had seen the machinery of their grade long before it was ever turned on me. I looked at the digital clock on my dashboard. It was nearly 6:00 in the morning. The pitch-black sky was just beginning to bruise with the first faint purple streaks of dawn. The heating vents were blowing cold air. I was exhausted. My eyes were burning, and I was still wearing the same slate-gray trousers and silk blouse from the catastrophic dinner the night before. But as I held that dark card, a profound, chilling clarity washed over me. The numb terror of being abandoned evaporated, replaced by a slow-burning, intensely focused energy. I had spent my entire adult life playing defense against my own blood. I had built walls, hidden my assets, and guarded my boundaries, all while desperately hoping they would eventually learn to love me without needing to use me. They had just proven that hope was a terminal liability. I decided right then to bet the absolute last shred of my trust on the only woman who had never treated me like a pawn on a chessboard. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. I did not bother looking for a coffee shop or a place to change clothes. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the desolate supermarket parking lot, steering my vehicle straight toward the heart of the downtown financial district. The city was just beginning to wake up as I navigated the empty, salt-stained streets. I followed the engraved address, turning away from the modern glass skyscrapers and into a neighborhood dominated by early 20th century architecture. I finally parked in front of a massive, imposing structure made entirely of weathered graystone and heavy wrought iron. It stood on a quiet corner radiating an aura of impenetrable silence. There were no bright digital displays in the windows, no cheerful marketing banners advertising free checking accounts. A small, understated bronze plaque next to the heavy double doors read Mercer Reserve Trust. It did not look like a bank designed for the public. It looked exactly like a fortress, a meticulously constructed vault designed to safeguard the history and the leverage of people who knew with absolute certainty that they would eventually be betrayed. I took a deep breath, grasped my grandmother's card tightly in my right hand, and stepped out of the car. I pushed open the heavy brass and glass doors of Mercer Reserve Trust. The interior did not resemble any retail banking branch I had ever visited. There were no stanchions, no digital queue monitors, no bright promotional pamphlets. The lobby was a vast echoing chamber of polished marble and dark walnut paneling, smelling faintly of lemon wax and old expensive paper. Behind a massive semicircular mahogany desk sat a single receptionist, a woman impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit. She looked up with a perfectly calibrated expression of polite inquiry, likely taking in my heavily wrinkled slate-gray trousers, my disheveled hair, and the dark, exhausted circles under my eyes. She probably assumed I was completely lost. I did not speak. I simply walked across the echoing marble floor, reached the edge of her pristine desk, and slid the heavy charcoal card across the polished wood. The receptionist's eyes dropped to the card. The transformation was instantaneous and almost frightening to witness. The polite, superficial customer service smile vanished, replaced immediately by a posture of absolute rigid difference. She did not ask for my identification. She did not ask how she could help me. She simply picked up a heavy black landline phone, dialed a single digit, and spoke in a hushed, urgent whisper. Within 2 minutes, the soft chime of a hidden elevator echoed through the lobby. A man stepped out and walked purposefully toward us. He was perhaps in his late 50s, wearing the charcoal pinstriped suit that looked flawlessly bespoke, his silver hair neatly parted. He possessed the quiet, sharp demeanor of a man who spent his life managing the catastrophic secrets of the incredibly wealthy. "I am Owen Pierce," he said, his voice a smooth low baritone, director of private trust. "Please come with me." He did not ask for my name either. He simply gestured toward the open elevator doors. We rode 3 stories up in complete silence. He led me down a thickly carpeted hallway lined with heavy oak doors, finally ushering me into a massive corner office overlooking the icy gray waters of the river. He gestured to a high-backed leather chair opposite his desk. I sat down, my spine perfectly straight, my hands folded tightly in my lap to hide their slight trembling. Owen Pierce took his seat behind the desk. He placed the dark card onto a small discreet scanning pad built directly into the leather bladder. A green light flashed once. He turned his attention to a sleek computer monitor angled away from my view. For a few seconds, there was only the soft clicking of his keyboard. Then the typing stopped completely. I watched his face. I saw his eye scan a block of text on his screen, dart back to the beginning, and read it a second time. A profound stillness settled over him. The professional detached mask he wore slipped just a fraction, revealing a flash of genuine, unadulterated shock. He slowly turned away from the monitor and looked directly at me. "Maker," Owen said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I need you to sit back and take a very deep breath before I open this physical file." My mind immediately raced toward the most logical conclusions. I braced myself for the revelation of a massive inheritance, a hidden offshore account, or perhaps a massive emergency liquid fund Lorraine had secretly amassed over the decades. I thought about the balances, the routing numbers, the immediate financial relief that could secure my independence by noon. "My grandmother left me a monetary trust," I stated, my voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. Owen shook his head slowly. "No, Ms. Baker, Lorraine did not leave you easy money. Liquid capital can be stolen, squandered, or easily coerced out of the hands of the beneficiary. Your grandmother was far too pragmatic for that. What she left you is a highly secure, heavily fortified mechanism of absolute legal protection and corporate asset control." He unlocked a deep bottom drawer of his desk and withdrew a thick red roppet-tied legal folio. He laid it flat on the desk but kept his hand resting firmly on top of it. "This specific file," Owen continued, his gaze piercing, "is governed by a strictly conditional trigger clause. It was explicitly designed so that it could not be accessed, could not even be acknowledged to exist unless a very specific set of parameters were met. The primary condition stipulates that you must present this card in person entirely alone, immediately following a family coercion event directly related to financial obligations or a sudden loss of housing. The heir left my lungs in a sharp, silent rush. It was terrifyingly exact. It was as if Lorraine had possessed a crystal ball, watching the disastrous Sunday dinner unfold, watching my father slide that lone folder across the table, watching my mother pack my suitcase, and watching me get thrown out into the freezing night. She had known. She had known the exact methodology they would eventually use to break me. Seeing my reaction, Owen carefully untied the red cord. He opened the folio and extracted a single sheet of heavy ivory stationery. It was covered in my grandmother's distinct, elegant, sharply slanted handwriting. He slid it across the desk toward me. I picked it up. The ink was dark navy, the strokes firm and unyielding. If you are reading this, it means you brought the card to the reserve alone. It means the Baker family has finally stopped asking and started demanding. It means they have actively tried to turn you into the very instrument that legitimizes their wrongdoings. I have watched them groom you for this role since you were a child. Dudlers builds the tracks. Linder paints them in the colors of love, and Gavin blindly dances inside them. When they finally back you into the corner, when they force your hand, you must not be soft-hearted. I did not raise you to be collateral damage. I built a wall for you. Now you must learn how to lock the gate. I read the words 3 times. The persistent hollow ache of betrayal that had been gnawing at my chest since the previous night began to harden into something entirely different. It solidified into a cold, sharp, diamond-hard resolve. I placed the letter carefully back onto the desk. What exactly did she leave me to control? I asked, my tone now matching his professional detachment. Owen pulled a thick stack of corporate registry documents from the folio. Let us begin with the largest piece on the board, Mercer Dew Holdings. It is the corporate entity that holds the absolute title to the industrial waterfront properties, specifically the large red brick warehouse district where your brother currently operates his business, Forgecraft. My father manages that, I replied instinctively. He has managed it for years. He handles the property taxes, the leasing agreements, the maintenance schedules. He operates under the illusion of management, Owen corrected sharply, tapping a perfectly manicured finger against a notarized document. This is the first major revelation of this trust years ago. Anticipating exactly this kind of overreach, Lorraine quietly restructured the operating agreement of Mercer Dock Holdings. She deliberately stripped Dudlers Baker of all unilateral executive authority. He holds no actual legal power to leverage, sell, or encumber that property. Instead, she established a contingency succession plan. She designated you, Violet Baker, as the sole successor, holding exactly 51% of the contingency management rights. I stared at the paperwork, my mind violently recalibrating every single assumption I had ever held about my family's financial hierarchy. 51%. It was the magic number. It was the undeniable threshold of absolute control. That means I started tracing the logic aloud, that if my father does not have the legal right to use that waterfront property as collateral, then any financial maneuver he attempts to make involving that land is entirely fraudulent. It is entirely fraudulent unless you explicitly authorize it. Owen finished the sentence for me, his eyes gleaming with a fierce, quiet intelligence. If you activate this contingency condition today, his signature on any document referencing Mercer Dock Holdings becomes legally worthless. The puzzle pieces from the catastrophic dinner suddenly snapped together with sickening violence. The equipment loan that was not an equipment loan, the bizarre environmental liability waiver, the dense, obscure managerial consent addendums Dudlers had aggressively ordered me to sign without reading. They had not been trying to get a simple bank loan to buy dehumidifiers for Gavin. The loan, I whispered, the realization washing over me like ice water. The commercial contract they wanted me to sign last night. Owen leaned forward, steepling his fingers, delivering the final, devastating blow that shattered the entire illusion of my family. Exactly, Owen said, his voice slicing through the quiet room. The loan they violently pressured you to sign did not require your pristine credit score first and foremost. They were not using you as a simple financial backer. The bank required the signature of the one person they have desperately hidden from you for years is actually the true legal authority. You are the only one with the power to block the transaction or legitimize it entirely. They needed you to blindly sign away your 51% control without ever realizing you possessed it in the first place. They had not kicked me out because I was selfish. They had kicked me out because I had accidentally refused to sign away my own stolen crown, and they were running out of time to force my hand before the entire fraudulent house of cards collapsed. Owen did not allow the shock of his revelation to settle into the quiet room. He reached across his expansive desk and pressed a polished silver button on his intercom console. He spoke a single sentence, requesting the immediate presence of the lead trust attorney. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy oak door opened. A woman walked in, carrying a thick leather binder. Owen introduced her as Celeste Harlow. She possessed the sharp, uncompromising posture of a predator, entirely comfortable in the deep waters of corporate litigation. She did not offer me a warm smile or any hollow words of sympathy. She simply took the leather chair next to mine, opened her binder, and extracted a perfect high-resolution copy of the exact same manila folder my father had aggressively pushed across the dining table less than 12 hours ago. I stared at the duplicated pages, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. Celeste noticed my gaze and immediately explained the mechanics of her possession. She stated that because the physical asset listed in that specific loan application was deeply entangled with Lorraine's protected trust, the underwriting bank was legally obligated to run a secondary title verification. The moment the property address hit the automated clearing system, Mercer Reserve received a silent, high-priority alert. They had secured the entire digital file before my father even finished pouring his afternoon coffee. Celeste leaned forward, her perfectly manicured finger tapping sharply against the summary page. She began to dissect the document with the cold, methodical precision of a surgeon performing an autopsy. She pointed out that the document was heavily disguised as a standard equipment financing agreement, but it was actually an incredibly aggressive short-term commercial bridge note. The industrial rotary dehumidifiers, the specialized box trucks, and the thermal imaging cameras Gavin had so passionately yelled about were nothing more than a thin cosmetic smoke screen. The actual underlying collateral securing the massive sum of money was the riverfront warehouse itself, along with the sprawling 3 acres of undeveloped dirt directly behind it, the land that had belonged to my family for generations. Then she turned to page 4. She directed my attention to the specific clauses I had blindly questioned the night before. They were not standard boilerplate trash, as my brother had so violently claimed. They were a meticulously crafted poison pill. Celeste explained the true nature of the managerial capacity consent form. If I had succumbed to the exhaustion and the screaming, if I had picked up that pen and signed my name on that single dotted line, I would not have just been co-signing a loan. I would have been executing a binding legal ratification. The document contained a deeply buried retroactive clause. By signing, I would have officially confirmed that every single executive decision, every financial commitment, and every property encumbrance executed by Doublers and Gavin over the past 60 months was entirely legitimate from the very beginning. I would have washed their dirty hands with my clean name, but the environmental liability waiver was the true masterpiece of their trap. The old riverfront district was built on decades of industrial runoff. Celeste informed me that the soil beneath the warehouse was practically guaranteed to require a massive multi-phase remediation project before any new construction could legally commence. The waiver I was supposed to sign shifted 100% of that catastrophic financial liability squarely onto my shoulders. If the Environmental Protection Agency came knocking, my father and my brother would walk away completely clean, leaving me to personally absorb millions of dollars in federal cleanup fines. I felt a sickening wave of vertigo wash over me. But Celeste was not finished. She turned to a new section of her binder, pulling out a freshly printed municipal zoning map and a confidential letter of intent. She was about to reveal the true motive behind the sudden, desperate urgency of the Sunday night ambush. She explained that just 14 days ago, the city council had quietly passed a preliminary approval for a massive sweeping commercial redevelopment project along the old riverfront. The value of the dirt sitting underneath Gavin's failing restoration company was no longer measured in the hundreds of thousands. It was skyrocketing by the hour. A private equity investment group operating under the name Red Quarry Development had already approached my father. They had silently floated an initial purchase offer that was easily 10 times the total value of the bridge note my family was trying to secure. The sheer cruelty of their strategy finally locked into place, forming a complete, terrifying picture. Dudlers and Gavin never had any real intention of building a sustainable long-term future for Forge Craft Mitigation. They were not trying to save a struggling business. They were executing a smash and grab. Their plan was entirely predatory. They intended to use my perfect credit score and my hidden legal authority to scrub the fraudulent chain of title completely clean. They were going to pump the property full of high-interest debt, siphon off the cash to quietly erase Gavin's mountain of liabilities, and then immediately flip the newly sanitized land to Red Quarry Development. They would walk away with a massive fortune, while I would be left holding the empty bag of a legally binding contract, completely oblivious to the fact that I had just signed away my own inheritance to finance my brother's bailout, as if to drive the final nail into the coffin of my family's morality. Celeste withdrew a final stack of papers from her leather binder. They were internal meeting minutes and operating resolutions from Mercer Dock Holdings. The dates stamped across the top margins spanned the last 3 years. Every single one of them bore the heavy, aggressive signature of Douglas Baker, explicitly signing his name under the official title of managing member. Celeste looked at me, her dark eyes entirely devoid of pity. She stated the legal reality with absolute clarity. Douglas had been signing binding corporate documents, filing state tax returns, and executing vendor contracts, acting as the sole owner, long after my grandmother had quietly stripped him of all executive power. Every stroke of his pen for the last 36 months had been an act of deliberate prosecutable fraud. He was not just an overbearing father trying to control his daughter. He was a desperate man sitting on a ticking time bomb of federal forgery charges, and the only way to defuse it was to bully me into signing a retroactive pardon before I ever knew what I was actually forgiving. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, staring blankly at the mountain of undeniable evidence spread across the polished mahogany desk. The profound hollow ache in my chest vanished entirely, replaced by a terrifying absolute stillness. The greatest shock of the past 12 hours was not the fact that my mother had packed my suitcase, or that my father had thrown me out into the freezing night, or that my brother had smiled while watching me break. The true earth-shattering revelation was that my family had not simply been exploiting my sense of duty. They had not just been taking advantage of my stable income or my desperate desire for their approval. For years, they had been actively, methodically cultivating me as their ultimate mark. They had kept me close, policed my boundaries, and demanded my loyalty, all while patiently waiting for the precise moment the trap needed to be sprung. They had structured an entire architecture of deception, and they had cast me as the sacrificial load-bearing pillar. I looked at Owen. I looked at Celeste. I felt the heavy dark plastic of the Mercer Reserve card resting in my pocket. The woman who walked into this office an hour ago was a discarded daughter, reeling from a sudden violent eviction. But the woman sitting in the chair now understood the exact rules of the game she had been unknowingly playing her entire life, and for the first time in 31 years, I was holding all the winning cards. Celeste Harlow closed her thick leather binder with a sharp, decisive snap that echoed perfectly in the quiet office. She looked at me with the steady, calculating gaze of a woman who had orchestrated the destruction of countless corporate empires. She told me in no uncertain terms that the absolute worst thing I could do right now was react emotionally. Confronting my father, screaming at my brother, or crying to my mother would only validate their twisted narrative that I was an unstable, hysterical daughter lashing out in the deep, cold waters of commercial law. Volume meant nothing. Paperwork meant everything. She advised me to strike first, not with a phone call, but with a paralyzing avalanche of administrative procedure. My retaliation began with a simple silver fountain pen. Sitting at Owen Pierce's expansive mahogany desk, I signed my name to a towering stack of legal documents. With the first signature, I officially activated the 51% contingency management clause my grandmother had secretly embedded in the Mercer Dock Holdings operating agreement. With the second, I authorized Celeste to file an immediate internal dispute notice. This was a highly aggressive legal maneuver designed to completely freeze the company assets. It effectively locked out any possibility of a rushed emergency transfer of the waterfront property. Then I signed a sweeping power of attorney, granting the Mercer Reserve legal team the absolute authority to act on my behalf. Before I even left the building, Celeste's team was already drafting targeted certified notifications to the commercial lender, the title insurance underwriter, the county registry of deeds, and the legal representatives of Red Quarry Development. We were quietly salting the earth around my family's fraudulent loan application. With the legal machinery firmly in motion, Owen authorized an immediate emergency disbursement from the trust. It was enough capital to secure my physical independence. I did not return to the sprawling suburbs. Instead, I rented a modest, fully furnished short-term apartment on a month-to-month lease located just 3 blocks away from the Crest Hollow Health Network corporate campus. I spent 2 hours at a local department store buying a few conservative work suits, basic toiletries, and a phone charger. The next morning, I walked into my office at exactly 8:00, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and sat down at my desk. I spent the next 8 hours meticulously reviewing medical supply contracts, highlighting compliance errors, and attending interdepartmental meetings as if my entire life had not been violently appended 48 hours prior. I did not answer the frantic text messages or the blocked phone calls lighting up my personal cell phone. I simply existed in a state of absolute, unbreakable routine. By continuing to function perfectly in my high-pressure corporate job, I was cementing a crucial, undeniable paper trail of my own sanity and reliability. If this battle eventually reached a courtroom, any judge would look at my flawless employment record and my calm, documented behavior and then compare it to the chaotic, desperate flailing of a family drowning in undisclosed debt. When I returned to my quiet, empty apartment I did not rest. I opened my laptop and began an exhaustive, forensic excavation of my own digital history. The skills I used to hunt down fraudulent billing codes for the hospital network were perfectly suited for dismantling my family's lines. I'd dug through years of archived emails, text message backups, and saved cloud documents. Without the blinding filter of family loyalty, the sheer audacity of their grooming process became horrifyingly clear. I found an email from Gavin dated 14 months ago. He had casually asked me to email him a high-resolution scan of my physical signature, claiming he needed it as a placeholder to expedite some routine insurance paperwork for a minor truck accident. I found a text thread from my father sent just prior to the Thanksgiving holiday. Mixed in with casual questions about dinner plans was a direct, seemingly innocent request for my social security number and the exact issue date of my state driver's license. He had claimed he was simply updating the beneficiary forms on a life insurance policy and needed the data to ensure everything was properly filed. I had handed over the keys to my identity without a single second of hesitation, blinded by the deep-seated assumption that a father would never use those numbers to forge a multi-million-dollar commercial liability contract. While I was hunting through my past, Celeste's team was aggressively tearing apart Gavin's present. They brought in a forensic property auditor named Nina Voss. Nanner was a relentless, humorless woman who viewed financial ledgers the way a detective views a crime scene. Within 48 hours, she had ripped the polished facade entirely off Forgecraft Mitigation. The thriving business my brother constantly bragged about was actually a decaying shell of catastrophic liabilities. NAR discovered that Gavin was currently severely delinquent on accounts with 3 major heavy equipment suppliers. He owed tens of thousands of dollars to an independent roofing contractor he had hired for a side project and subsequently refused to pay. More incredibly, she found that the specific section of the red brick warehouse where Gavin had proudly set up his primary operational headquarters was not even legally cleared for commercial occupancy. The space was entirely blocked by an incomplete municipal environmental inspection from 2 years ago, a red flag Dudlers had intentionally ignored to let his golden boy play businessman. The most damning piece of evidence Nanner uncovered revolved around Gavin's supposed warehouse improvements. For the past year, Gavin had frequently complained at family dinners about the massive personal expenses he was incurring to modernize the aging structure. Nina managed to subpoena the internal accounting records through the dispute filing. She found a long string of invoices detailing expensive plumbing overhauls, electrical grid upgrades, and structural reinforcements. But when Nina dispatched a quiet, independent inspector to walk the exterior of the property, they found absolutely nothing. There was no new copper piping, no upgraded breaker panels, no reinforced steel beams. The invoices were entirely fabricated, padded with wildly inflated material costs. Gavin was not improving the asset. He was systematically bleeding out whatever meager cash flow the company had left, generating fake expenses to hide his own gross financial mismanagement. Sitting in the glowing light of my laptop screen, reading NAR's preliminary audit report, a dozen tiny, previously overlooked memories finally snapped into perfect focus. I suddenly understood why Gavin had always possessed such a smug, unshakable certainty about the future of his failing shop. He knew he never actually had to turn a profit. It was just biding his time until the property was sold out from under me. I understood why doublers always spoke about the riverfront dirt with an absolute dictatorial possessiveness, referring to it as our ultimate safety net, subtly reinforcing his unearned ownership. And finally, I understood why my grandmother, even in her fading final months, had fiercely refused to give the heavy brass key to her old ground floor office to anyone but me. She had been the only one actively guarding the gates. Late Thursday evening, my phone chimed with a secure message from Celeste. Nina had just successfully intercepted a highly sensitive scheduling file from the title insurance company. She forwarded the document directly to my inbox. It was an official finalized calendar invitation for a commercial loan closing. The location was set at a premium title agency overlooking the river. The time was scheduled for 2:00 on Friday afternoon. The attendee list included the senior commercial lender, the title agent, Dudlers Baker, Gavin Baker, and a blank line explicitly reserved for the primary guarantor. A cold, hard smile touched my lips as I read the screen. Despite my absolute silence, despite my sudden disappearance, despite the fact that I had not spoken a single word to them in 4 days, my family had nottled the meeting. Their arrogance was so deeply entrenched, their belief in their ultimate control over me so absolute, that they actually thought the Sunday night eviction was a success. They firmly believed that right now I was broken, desperate, and freezing in a cheap motel room. They were absolutely convinced that by Friday afternoon I would quietly walk through the polished doors of that title company, thoroughly defeated, ready to blindly sign my name on the dotted line just to buy my way back into their conditional grace. They thought they only needed one final piece to execute their perfect theft. They thought they were waiting for a victim. They had no idea they had actually summoned the owner. On Thursday morning, before I navigated through the morning traffic to my office at the hospital network, Owen Pierce requested my presence at the bank for one final review of the physical archives. We sat in the same quiet corner office, overlooking the freezing gray waters of the river. Owen did not pull out another standard legal folio. Instead, he placed a heavy dark green archival box directly onto the center of the mahogany desk. It was tightly bound with a thick, tamper-evident wire seal. He explained that my grandmother had established a strictly enforced Level 2 restriction on this specific box. It was not to be unsealed during the initial revelation of the trust documents. It was only to be opened if the legal team discovered that my family was actively formally moving toward a catastrophic financial closing event. The intercepted Friday afternoon calendar invitation had triggered that exact condition. Owen retrieved a small pair of steel cutters and snapped the wire seal. Inside the heavily insulated box lay a meticulously organized collection of my grandmother's personal work journals, dated copies of municipal zoning records, and a single sealed envelope with my name written across the front in her sharp, uncompromising script. I opened the letter first. The heavy ivory paper smelled faintly of the dried lavender she used to keep in her old wooden desk drawers. The words were not written as a gentle emotional farewell from a dying matriarch. They were drafted as a cold tactical briefing for a war she knew with absolute certainty I would eventually have to fight. Lorraine wrote that if I was sitting in Owen's office reading this letter, it meant that everything had reached the final stage. She detailed how for over a decade Douglas had relentlessly pressured her to legally transfer the entire waterfront property into his exclusive control. He had used every psychological manipulation tactic at his disposal. He had constantly pleaded with her to keep the assets securely within the Baker family name, arguing passionately that he needed the foundation to build a lasting multi-generational legacy for his children. But Lorraine had seen right through his polished suburban father routine. She wrote that Douglas never once looked at the historic brick warehouse as a piece of heritage or a family anchor. He looked at it exclusively as an unencumbered asset, a massive, untapped reservoir of raw equity he could use as leverage to finance his own reckless financial ambitions. The second major revelation in her letter permanently shattered whatever lingering misplaced sympathy I might have still harbored for my younger brother. For years I had operated under the exhausting assumption that Gavin was simply an arrogant, incompetent fool who was being constantly manipulated, directed, and shielded by my parents. Lorraine corrected that misconception with ruthless clarity. Gavin was not an innocent, brainwashed bystander swept up in my father's grand schemes. He was a highly willing, intensely eager co-conspirator. Lorraine had meticulously documented private conversations she had overheard years ago. Long before Gavin ever dreamed up his restoration company, he had discovered the early whispered city council plans regarding the future riverfront commercial rezoning. He knew the property values were destined to explode. He had laughed with Douglas in the driveway about how easily they could turn those useless, crumbling old bricks into real money once the stubborn old woman was finally out of the way. But it was the next paragraph that made my blood run absolutely cold, locking the past and the present together in a terrifying display of predatory behavior. It detailed an event that completely redefined the depth of my father's moral depravity. 7 years ago, Lorraine had undergone a severe, highly invasive orthopedic surgery. While she was recovering in her own bedroom, heavily sedated on powerful prescription painkillers and drifting in and out of consciousness, Douglas had come to visit her alone. He had brought a stack of what he smoothly claimed were routine medical insurance authorizations that required her immediate signature to prevent a lapse in coverage. He had deliberately slipped a completely different set of papers into the very middle of the stack, placed a heavy pen in her trembling hand, and softly urged her to sign them to make the terrifying hospital bills go away. Lorraine had been dizzy, nauseous, and entirely exhausted, but her mind was still sharp enough to recognize the heavy, distinctively textured paper of a full property deed transfer. She had dropped the pen, hit the emergency call button, and ordered him out of her house. It was that exact moment, lying utterly helpless in her bed, realizing her own son-in-law was entirely willing to steal her estate while she was medically compromised, that she decided to take permanent, silent action. The very next morning, she had called Owen Pierce to her bedside. She had secretly rewritten the company bylaws, stripped Douglas of all his phantom executive authority, and cemented the 51% contingency trap to the dark plastic card she eventually handed to me. Owen let the weight of the letter settle over the room before he reached back into the archival box. He pulled out a large, tightly rolled document and spread it flat across the wide desk, weighing down the corners with heavy brass paper weights. It was a highly detailed municipal engineering map of the entire waterfront district stamped with the City Planning Commission seal. He pointed a pen to the outline of the red brick warehouse and then slowly traced a long narrow strip of land that extended from the rear loading docks directly down to the water edge. This was the exact dirt lot Gavin currently used as his chaotic, disorganized staging area for his broken industrial fans, rusted trucks, and rotting building materials. Owen explained the true scale of the real estate play. The wealthy investors from Red Quarry Development had absolutely zero interest in Gavin's failing restoration business. They did not even want the historical brick warehouse structure itself. Their massive multi-million-dollar acquisition offer hinged entirely on that single, seemingly useless, trash-filled back. According to the newly approved city zoning blueprints, that specific strip of dirt was the only viable independent access route connecting the newly planned commercial boulevard directly to the highly anticipated luxury marina development. Without that specific piece of land, the developers could not build their primary access road, rendering their entire waterfront project essentially landlocked. The sheer brilliance and absolute malice of my family's dissection was staggering. Gavin's loud, obnoxious, failing business was nothing more than a carefully constructed, chaotic, physical smoke screen. They had intentionally placed a messy, noisy industrial operation right on top of the property to actively drive away casual buyers and perfectly mask the true strategic value of the land from the public eye. Gavin was evilly acting as the perfect decoy, crying poverty and begging for my financial help, while Dudlers quietly negotiated the transfer of the most valuable undeveloped access corridor in the entire city. I looked back down at the final page of my grandmother's letter. Her closing instructions were not vague philosophical advice about finding peace or moving on. They were precise, calculated, and legally devastating directives designed for maximum destruction. She wrote that if Dudlers ever attempted to force me to sign anything related to corporate management, property collateral, or environmental liability, I was absolutely not to stop him early in the process. I was not to confront him in the living room, nor was I to argue with him over a dining room table. If I warned them that I knew the truth, they would simply retreat, regroup, hide the paperwork, and invent a brand new, highly complex method to forge my compliance in the dark. Lorraine explicitly instructed me to let them feel completely victorious. I had to let them march confidently, armed with their fraudulent papers, all the way to the official closing table. I had to let them sit down in a formal room in front of the commercial lenders, the title agents, and the corporate attorneys, fully believing they had successfully stolen my financial future. Only then, at the absolute final second, when they were entirely exposed, and there was absolutely no room left for them to lie or retreat, was I to step into the room and appear as the true, undisputed owner of the estate, sitting in the silent office, holding the heavy ivory paper in my hands. I felt a profound tectonic shift in my own identity. For my entire life, I had viewed my grandmother's gift of the dark card as a desperate protective shield, a secret way to simply run away and survive a financial ambush. But as I stared at the engineering map and the undeniable proof of their decade-long conspiracy, I finally understood the terrifying magnitude of what she had actually given me. Lorraine had not just left me a defensive mechanism to hide behind. She had meticulously mapped out the exact topography of their greed. She had anticipated their ultimate betrayal, documented their underlying crimes, and handed me the detonator. She had prepared a flawless legal pathway for me to end the suffocating cycle of manipulation in one single perfectly orchestrated, completely public, and entirely irreversible blow. I carefully folded the ivory letter, placed it securely into my leather bag alongside the dark card, and told Owen I would see him at the title agency on Friday afternoon. When my absence from the property stretched past the 48-hour mark with absolutely no communication, the Baker family's tactical approach violently shifted gears. The deafening silence I projected was something they had never encountered before. I had always been the dependable, predictable daughter who could be badgered into a panicked response. By entirely removing myself from their physical and digital reach, I forced them to change their strategy. The outright hostility of the Sunday night eviction was quickly replaced by a deeply unsettling, highly manufactured campaign of suburban psychological warfare. It started with my father. Dudlers abandoned his cold, dictatorial tone and transitioned into the role of a weary, reasonable patriarch, simply trying to mend a silly misunderstanding. My phone screen lit up on Tuesday morning with a long text message from him. He wrote that tempers had simply run too hot over the weekend, that everyone had said things they deeply regretted, and that it was time for us to sit down over a cup of coffee and resolve our minor differences exactly like adults. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting, designed to make me feel foolish for overreacting to being thrown out into the freezing night. But the velvet glove slipped at the very bottom of the message. Attached to his plea for peace was a sharp, high-resolution photograph of the official title company calendar invitation. He highlighted the Friday afternoon time slot. It was not an olive branch. It was a brightly lit countdown clock, a silent threat reminding me that his deadline was rapidly approaching. When I did not reply to his message, my mother immediately deployed her own weapon of choice. Linder weaponized the extended family. By Wednesday evening, I began receiving cautious, probing text messages from two of my aunts and a cousin who lived halfway across the state. They all used the exact same carefully constructed language. They said they were praying for me. They said they heard I was going through a very dark, emotionally unstable phase. Linder had spent the entire afternoon working the phones, painting a tragic, tearful portrait of a daughter who had suddenly suffered a severe mental breakdown, who was being manipulated by toxic outsiders, and who was now recklessly threatening to destroy her younger brother's absolute last chance at financial survival. She used the incredibly effective language of maternal worry to entirely mask her aggressive manipulation. In the eyes of my extended relatives, I was no longer the victim of an ambush. I was the villain actively tearing a loving family apart. Gaddon's approach was far less sophisticated, characterized by the erratic whiplash of a terrified narcissist losing his grip on his safety net. He sent me private messages that swung violently between pathetic begging and vicious cruelty. His first few texts were long, rambling paragraphs about how much he needed me, how the heavy equipment vendors were breathing down his neck, and how I was the only person smart enough to understand the paperwork. When those messages went entirely unread, his tone turned venomous. He texted that I was intensely jealous of his entrepreneurial spirit, claiming I was nothing but a bitter, glorified secretary who lacked the courage to take real risks. He promised that when the entire family collapsed into bankruptcy, the guilt would rest solely on my shoulders, and I would spend the rest of my life deeply regretting my selfish cowardice. Sitting in my sterile, temporary apartment, the urge to fire back a devastating reply was almost physically painful. I wanted to scream through the screen that I knew about the zoning laws, the private equity developers, and the forged management signatures. I wanted to burn their self-righteous narratives to the ground, but Celeste Harlow's voice echoed sharply in my mind. She had explicitly ordered me to entirely abandon the desire for emotional vindication. An argument over the phone was just noise, she had warned, but a documented trail of harassment was airtight leverage. I followed her instructions with clinical precision. I did not type a single letter in response. Instead, I opened a fresh digital folder. I took screenshots of every single text message, downloaded every single rambling voicemail, and saved every passive-aggressive email. I printed them out, meticulously logging the exact date and time of each communication. I was no longer an abused daughter absorbing the blows. I was an archavist, methodically cataloging a sustained campaign of emotional coercion. I was transforming their desperate, flailing attacks into an unbreakable chain of forensic evidence. The pressure reached a boiling point on Thursday morning when Douglas crossed a line I never thought he would dare to breach. I was sitting at my desk on the 4th floor of the Crest Hollow Health Network corporate campus when the internal phone line chimed. The head receptionist from the main lobby sounded deeply uncomfortable. She informed me that my father was standing at the front desk. He was dressed in his best suit, projecting the image of a deeply concerned, loving parent. He was telling the security personnel that there was a severe family medical emergency, that I was not answering my personal phone, and that he needed to be escorted up to my department immediately to speak with me in private. A hot flush of absolute humiliation burned the back of my neck. My rigidly separated, professional life was being invaded by the chaos of my bloodline. But beneath the profound embarrassment, a sharp, icy realization cut through my anxiety. Douglas Baker was a man who worshipped the concept of control. For him to risk a public scene in the middle of a massive corporate lobby meant he was entirely out of options. The clock was running out. The Friday signing was looming, and he was officially panicking. I took a slow, deep breath, instructed the receptionist to calmly inform him that I was unavailable, and explicitly requested that corporate security escort him off the private campus if he refused to leave the premises. He did not fight the guards. He turned around and walked out, but the incident proved that his carefully constructed facade was finally fracturing. While my family was busy attacking my character, my legal team was busy dismantling their defenses. Nina Voss contacted me that same afternoon with a highly alarming update. Her automated monitoring software set up through the county registry had just flagged a sudden burst of administrative activity regarding forgery mitigation. Someone had just attempted to rush file a brand new, backdated corporate resolution. The forged document explicitly attempted to grant Douglas sweeping retroactive indemnification for all property-related decisions. He was frantically trying to patch the gaping holes in his legal authority before the title agent scrutinized the file on Friday. The desperate maneuver confirmed one crucial fact. My father still firmly believed I was entirely ignorant of my grandmother's trust. He thought he was just tightening up a few loose ends to appease the bank, completely unaware that I already held the master key to the entire property. Then, the final devastating piece of the puzzle simply fell right into our laps. Celeste called me on a secure line just after 6:00 in the evening. Her usually flat, professional tone held a rare note of genuine triumph. She informed me that a woman named Maris Dunn had just contacted the Mercer Reserve Legal Department. Maris was a highly experienced independent certified public accountant who had briefly worked as an outsourced bookkeeper for Gavin's Restoration Company. She had abruptly quit her position 8 months ago. Maris had seen the formal dispute notices Celeste's team had quietly filed against the corporate entities earlier in the week. Recognizing the inevitable legal storm, she proactively reached out to protect her own professional license. She sat down with Celeste and provided a sworn-recorded statement. Maris confirmed that she had resigned specifically because she adamantly refused to continue manipulating the internal financial ledgers. She had been directly ordered to artificially inflate equipment invoices to hide massive cash shortfalls, but her testimony provided something far more lethal than proof of bad accounting. Marius explicitly stated on the record that she had been present in the warehouse office during a heated screaming match between Douglas and Gavin regarding a separate loan attempt earlier that year. During that argument, Douglas had violently reminded Gavin that they had to find a backdoor method to secure the funding because they both knew they lacked the legal authority to openly leverage the real estate without violence direct intervention. It was the ultimate smoking gun. It proved absolutely beyond a shadow of a legal doubt that both my father and my brother possessed clear conscious criminal intent. They knew they did not own the property. They knew the documents they were signing were fraudulent. With Maris Dunn's explosive testimony secured in our files, the dynamic of the impending confrontation shifted permanently. My thick leather binder was no longer just a collection of documents proving a nasty family dispute over an inheritance. It was a fully loaded, meticulously documented prosecutorial weapon. The Friday afternoon signing was no longer a trap my family had set for me. It had transformed into a ticking time bomb they were blindly building for themselves, and I was going to let them wire it all the way to the very last second. Celeste Harlow made the strategic decision to let the clock keep ticking. She did not cancel the 2:00 appointment. Instead, on Thursday night, she fired off a series of highly calibrated tactical legal notices to the commercial lender. These documents were drafted with surgical precision, hinting at an unresolved internal structural dispute, just enough to trigger the bank's internal compliance radar, but carefully omitting the catastrophic scale of the fraud. It was exactly enough to make the underwriters nervous, but nowhere near enough to make Douglas or Gavin abort the mission. They were being lured into the kill zone, exactly as my grandmother had envisioned. Early Friday morning, I sat in the conference room at Mercer Reserve and reviewed the final comprehensive closing packet that the title agency had prepared for the afternoon. It was a staggering mountain of paper, but one specific document buried near the very bottom finally explained their desperate, violent rush. It was a last-minute addendum altering the definition of managerial capacity. It contained a sweeping ratification clause. If I had walked into that room and put my name on that single page, Douglas would have possessed the legal power to declare that any and all prior disputes over the property had been completely resolved by family consensus. It was a magic eraser for a decade of forgery, but the absolute worst of it was a separate, deeply concealed commitment agreement tucked neatly behind the secondary loan contracts. It was a direct, legally binding bridge to Red Quarry development, The clause explicitly permitted the immediate transfer or refinancing of the underlying asset the absolute second the initial loan funds were dispersed. Their timeline was breathtakingly malicious. They did not intend to wait months or years. They intended to lock me into the massive environmental and financial liability, take the initial bank cash to clear Gavin's immediate debts, and then instantly flip the newly sanitized title to the developers before the ink on my signature was even dry. They were going to walk away multimillionaires by Friday sunset, leaving me chained to a toxic, sinking ship. Right before lunch, Celeste forwarded me a supplementary email that Maris Dunn had just unearthed from her old accounting archives. It was a message Gavin had sent to one of his angry equipment suppliers 6 months ago, begging for an extension on a past due invoice. The second paragraph made my stomach twist into a cold, hard knot. Gavin had written verbatim that his creditor should not worry about the cash flow because his sister always signs when pushed hard enough. Seeing those words stripped away the very last pathetic shreds of denial I had been clinging to. Gavin was not a reckless, impulsive kid in over his head. He was a cold, calculating predator who viewed my engineered compliance as his personal unlimited cash machine. The pain of reading that sentence was sharp, but it was incredibly necessary. It burned away the final remnants of my familial guilt. At 1:00, exactly 1 hour before the official closing, Owen Pierce orchestrated a highly confidential pre-meeting. He secured a private boardroom on the top floor of the title agency, entirely separate from the suite, where my family would soon gather. Sitting across the table from us were the senior title agent and the lead compliance officer for the commercial lender. They both walked into the room radiating corporate annoyance, clearly viewing this as a last-minute administrative nuisance. Then Owen slid the true legally binding operating agreement of Mercer Dock Holdings across the table, placing L. Rain's handwritten activation letter directly on top of it. I watched the color completely drain from the compliance officer's face. The title agent visibly recoiled as she read the contingency clauses and realized the sheer magnitude of the liability her agency was about to underwrite. They were entirely horrified. The immediate reaction of the bank representative was to storm downstairs and cancel the transaction on the spot, but Celeste raised her hand, stopping him cold. She explained that if we preemptively aborted the closing, Dudlers could potentially drag us into a protracted, messy civil lawsuit for Tarkius interference, claiming we had maliciously sabotaged a legitimate business deal before he even had the chance to present his case. We had to let them step fully into the trap. We all agreed on a very specific choreography. The signing would begin exactly on schedule. The lender and the title agent would proceed normally. Only when Dudlers or Gavin explicitly, verbally, and on the formal record presented false ownership of the property would Celeste and I enter the room. We would drop the counter dossier, issue the liability warnings, and let the entire fraudulent structure collapse squarely on their heads. I left the boardroom to prepare. I did not want to look like the terrified, desperate daughter they had thrown out into the cold. I changed into the simple, sharply tailored charcoal suit I had purchased earlier in the week. I wore absolutely no jewelry. I pulled my hair back into a tight, uncompromising style. I opened my small leather purse and slipped the heavy Mercer Reserve card into the front pocket. It felt entirely different now. It was no longer a mysterious keepsake or a sentimental token from a dying woman. It was the physical manifestation of my own authority, the key that had finally allowed me to stand up completely straight. At 2:10, I walked out of the side entrance of the building and circled around to the main parking lot, overlooking the old gray waters of the river. The winter air was biting, but my mind was perfectly clear, humming with a cold, terrifying anticipation. As I approached the glass front of the title agency, I saw them. My father's luxury sedan was parked near the front door. Gavin's aggressively branded company truck was taking up 2 spaces nearby. My mother's vehicle was idling near the curb. Through the expansive floor to ceiling windows of the main lobby, I could see the 3 of them sitting in the plush waiting area. Linda was nervously smoothing her skirt. Gavin was bouncing his leg, tapping repeatedly at his phone screen, but my eyes locked onto Dudlers. He was standing near the receptionist's desk holding a cup of coffee. He was smiling. It was a relaxed, confident, deeply satisfied smile. It was the exact expression of a man who genuinely believed his daughter had surrendered, who thought the game was over, and who was absolutely certain I was about to walk through those doors and step perfectly into the tragic, subservient role he had spent his entire life writing for me. The closing room smelled of expensive coffee and leather. Gavin was holding court, spinning his fabricated tales of Forgecraft's massive regional expansion to the senior commercial lender. Dudlers sat at the head of the heavy mahogany table, radiating the relaxed authority of a man who believed he had successfully engineered a masterpiece. Linder sat quietly to his left, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the heartbroken mother, forced to proceed without her emotionally unstable daughter, who had tragically lost her way. The title company representative cleared her throat, bringing the room to order. She slid the master closing packet toward the center of the table. She looked directly at my father and asked for the final verbal confirmation on the record regarding the chain of title and his current managerial capacity over Mercer Dock Holdings. Dudlers offered a smooth practice smile. He reached into his suit jacket, pulled out his expensive fountain pen, and confidently rested his hand on the thick stack of fraudulent documents. Before the gold nib of his pen could even brush the paper, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. The synchronized entrance was flawless. Celeste Harlow walked in first, radiating absolute legal terror. I followed a half-step behind her, flanked by Owen Pierce and Nina Voss. The compliance officer from the bank whom we had briefed an hour prior brought up the rear and quietly closed the door, locking the tension inside the room. The silence that crashed down on the table was absolute. Dudlers froze, his pen hovering in midair. Linder gasped, dropping her crumpled tissue. Gavin stared at me, his jaw slack, his arrogant smirk instantly evaporating into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. I did not look like the broken, freezing girl they had thrown out on a Sunday night. I stood perfectly straight in my charcoal suit, my expression carved from ice. Celeste did not offer a polite greeting. She walked directly to the center of the table and dropped a heavy red-tabbed legal folio right on top of my father's pending loan application. Dudlers Baker, Celeste stated, her voice slicing through the silent room like a blade. I am the lead trust attorney for Mercer Reserve. What I have just placed before you is the fully executed legally binding operating agreement for Mercer Dock Holdings, accompanied by the sealed activation letter drafted by the late Lorraine Mercer. It is accompanied by a formal notice of succession officially confirming that Violet Baker currently holds exactly 51% of the contingency management rights. Furthermore, the file contains irrefutable proof that you were stripped of all executive signing authority over 3 years ago. Dudlers' face drained of all color, shifting rapidly from a healthy tan to a sickly ashen gray. He opened his mouth to speak, but the carefully constructed lies he had relied on for years suddenly found no oxygen. Gavin, operating entirely on pure panic, desperately tried to pivot to his only remaining tactic. He shot up from his chair and pointed a shaking finger at me. "This is a private family matter," he shouted, his voice cracking under the pressure. "You cannot just barge in here and disrupt my business." "Violet, tell them to leave. We can work this out at home." "There is no home to work this out in." "Gavin," I replied, my voice remarkably calm and entirely devoid of the fear he was so accustomed to hearing, "and this stopped being a family matter the moment you attempted to commit federal bank fraud." Before Gavin could formulate another pathetic excuse, Nina Voss opened her laptop and turned the screen toward the center of the table. She initiated a secure video call. The screen flickered, revealing the tired, uncompromising face of Maris Dunn. Gavin stumbled backward, hitting the edge of his chair. He knew exactly who she was. MS. Dunn. Celeste addressed the screen, ensuring the commercial lender and the title agent were hanging on every word. "Can you please confirm for the official record the nature of the conversation you witnessed between Dudlers and Gavin Baker regarding the ownership of the riverfront property?" Maris looked directly into the camera. She stated clearly and unequivocally that she had personally witnessed both men, explicitly acknowledging that they did not possess the legal right to leverage the warehouse. She confirmed they knew the documents they were presenting today were entirely fraudulent and that they had openly discussed using coercive tactics to force my signature to cover their tracks. The final fatal blow fell immediately. The senior title agent aggressively pulled the master closing packet away from my father's reach. The compliance officer stepped forward, addressing the bank representatives. He formally announced that the commercial transaction was halted effectively immediately. He stated that the underwriting bank was officially logging a massive material fraud alert against both Forgecraft Mitigation and Douglas Baker personally. All pending financial commitments were permanently frozen, and the entire dossier was being transferred directly to the internal corporate legal department for immediate review and potential prosecution. The perfect theft was dead. Douglas erupted. The quiet, terrifying control he had maintained my entire life finally shattered into a million pieces. He slammed his fists onto the table, his face twisted in a mask of absolute rage. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You are destroying this family. You are letting a piece of dirt come between your own family." For 31 years, that exact tone would have made me shrink, apologize, and surrender. But the woman standing in that boardroom felt absolutely nothing but a cold clinical pity. I did not shake. I did not break eye contact. "I am not destroying anything," I told him, my voice steady and completely unyielding. "You weaponized this family. You used the concept of love as a tool to steal my inheritance, and you tried to chain me to a mountain of toxic liability so you could sell my property to Red Quarry Development and walk away rich. You built the track, Dad. I just refused to step inside it." I turned to the title agent and handed her a single sheet of paper I had signed that morning. As the newly activated legal majority manager of Mercer Dock Holdings, I officially issued an immediate termination of use. I revoked Forgecraft's temporary unpermitted occupancy of the rear warehouse section. I simultaneously submitted a formal notice demanding a comprehensive, independent, forensic audit of the company's financial books spanning the last 5 years, explicitly banning Douglas Baker from ever representing the entity in any legal or financial capacity ever again. Just as the silence settled over the ruined room, Owen Pierce delivered the absolute final stroke. He stepped forward and handed me a thick glossy binder. It was not a loan document. It was a preliminary partnership approval from an elite, independent, urban redevelopment consulting group. Lorraine had quietly contacted them months before her passing. "Instead of allowing your brother to gut the property," Owen announced to the room, "and Baker will be retaining full ownership. She will clear the legal titles, remediate the land properly, and transition the historic warehouse into a subsidized small business rental collective. It will be officially named the L. Rain House Collective." There was no dramatic screaming left. There was no physical altercation. There was only the absolute suffocating realization of total defeat. Douglas looked at the documents, looked at the banking executives who were now treating him like a biohazard, and finally looked at me. He saw the iron wall my grandmother had built, and he knew he could never break it. He turned around and walked out of the boardroom in complete public disgrace. Linda followed closely behind him, her fake tears replaced by genuine, terrified panic. Gavin lingered for a few seconds longer. He stood by the mahogany table, looking at the frozen loan documents, then up at me. For the very first time in his life, he truly understood that the shortcut he thought would always be there was permanently gone. The infinite well of second chances had completely dried up. He swallowed hard, lowered his head, and practically ran out the door to chase after our parents. Nobody was arrested in that room. There were no flashing police lights or chaotic scenes in the lobby. But as the heavy oak doors closed behind them, I knew every single avenue of money, power, and privilege they had desperately tried to steal had just violently slammed shut in their faces. An hour later, I stood completely alone on the freezing edge of the old riverfront. The water looked dark and calm against the fading winter light. The massive red brick warehouse stood silently behind me, the future site of the L. Rain House Collective. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the heavy charcoal Mercer Reserve card. I held it up, feeling the cold plastic press against my skin. Looking at the property, I finally understood the most profound truth my grandmother had left me. Lorraine did not just give me a massive fortune so I could live an easy, carefree life. She gave me a permanent, unbreakable mechanism of power so I would never, ever have to kneel before anyone who dared to call themselves family while treating me like an asset. And as I watched the river flow by, I knew that was the most perfect, absolute revenge I could have ever asked for. Thank you so much for listening to this story today, and I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. Please do not forget to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people around the world. Thanks to all.